Allora, Mac. Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another segment here on Project Purpose. For those of you who are new, we cover topics that relate to mental health, mental wellness, and education on a week by week basis. And today's topic of discussion is education. I want to talk about critical thinking. And I want to talk about critical thinking because I think that we falsely assume that critical thinking is a fundamental learning objective in our modern education system. That isn't the case. Schooling wasn't built to teach us to think critically. I mean, there was a point in time where that was the case when people were more focused on like literary arts and like philosophy. But now even those concepts, those themes, like unless you go to university and you take an elective, that's not something that you're necessarily taught to do. And so when we go to school, especially if we're going to school from primary through to high school and not necessarily exploring like post-secondary education, recognize that it's really about giving you the fundamentals to enter the job market. And we need to understand that the fundamentals to enter the job market doesn't necessarily require critical thinking. There's a certain tier and level of management that think critically, but at the job market that your schooling system is preparing you for is sort of an industrial job market where your job is to produce, right? So it's your ability to be able to do repetitive tasks, to compute, and to get specific inputs, you generate specific outputs. When we think about the subjects that we take in school, whether it's English, whether it's math, or like the RRR, even the way that they're taught, they're not taught to encourage critical thinking or to encourage thought exploration. Like, I think that we have too little teachers and too little time to give everyone the ability to cultivate that. It's really to memorize like what you take with specific information in a specific context in order to be considered as performant. And I think that we need to realize that performance is not an indicator of understanding. Being able to memorize information, to regurgitate it, doesn't mean that you fully understand that information. It doesn't mean that you understand the context behind that information. And being able to like recite facts, it doesn't mean that you really understand like the premise of the facts in and of themselves. And so I think sometimes we mistake knowledge for the sake of acquiring it as being able to think critically. And I think someone who has a lot of knowledge is definitely put in a position where they can pull on different pieces of information that they can leverage together to think critically. But knowledge in and of itself, performance in and of itself, the ability to take a specific input and repeat the expected output, those are not indicators of critical thinking. And so while those will prepare you for a specific job market, they are less and less meeting the standard of what is expected in a digital job market. So in a digital job market, a lot of the rote tasks, the repetitive tasks, the computing, all of that we can do for a large extent with AI, with artificial intelligence. And that doesn't mean that we're completely eliminating people, but it does mean that we don't need as many people, right? Because what we can do better with AI is we can control for deviations, we can control for variance that creates loss in productivity, loss in quality, loss in performance. And so it's better to supplement the, I guess, entry level jobs with this AI capability, which means we need less people to enter into those specific roles. Now, what does that mean for you if you are now in a position where you have finished your education, you're wanting to transition into the job market, and you're finding that the roles are harder to come by because a lot of what we can do with an entry level job, we're able to maintain with an automation, with a form of AI. Well, you need to find a way to tier up, and how you tier up is you find yourself in a medium that requires your thinking capabilities. But if you are looking for a career that requires your thinking capabilities, now that means that you need to be more VUCA oriented. And so I've talked a little bit about VUCA on my channel, but I'm going to be more explicit here. I'm going to really pair it to the skill set that you need that is over and above what your educational system is going to provide you. Now, I think in university, and I remember when I was trying to conceptualize for myself, like, what does it mean to go to university? And at the time, my mother had told me university is where you really have a full view of the world around you. Like growing up in a small town, like you have a very small scope of reference by way of like the world beyond your backyard. When you go to university, you have the opportunity to cross paths with people from so many different walks of life that it's going to impact you. It's going to impact the way you see the world, the way you see yourself, and the way you organize and orient in the world. It's going to teach you how to think. And so that was my experience. When I went to university, I was taught how to think, but I had, I think, support already because of the extracurricular activities that I did prior to university. So I was able to bridge that gap. And I think what you need to understand is that the gap between high school and university is getting larger. So if you're not doing things to supplement your child's education growing up, then it's going to be the case that they go to university or they go to college and they're unable to bridge that gap. And even when I was going to university, that was like now just in and around 15 years ago, the model was set up so that by the second year, kids who didn't have necessarily the supplementary education that enabled them to think critically at the level that was required in an academic setting, that was the university that I had gone to, they were filtered out. So the students that I went to school with in year 1 and year 2, a large majority of those students didn't exist in year 3 and year 4. And that's because the school recognized that it would let as many people in because it paid the bills essentially, but not everyone that got into the university was going to graduate with a certificate, right? And that was because not everyone necessarily was able to bridge the gap between what to think based on like what you told them to think and how to think. And I think that we need to really understand that there's a difference between knowing what to think and how to respond based on what someone's expecting of you, and knowing how to think when there are no expectations that are explicitly laid out, but you're just taking the factors that are laid out in front of you and making the best possible choice with that information. And I think that demarcation, in my experience, really changed the way that my peer groups evolved throughout university. And so I think about like my year 1 in my psychology class, there was hundreds of us in that psychology class. It was like 200 participants in a massive school auditorium. But when I finished my cognitive neuroscience degree, and that was the degree that I had that involved, psychology and artificial intelligence and robotics and philosophy, I started out with like 200 students at minimum in each class. I graduated, first I had 6 people in my research thesis class. My graduating class only had 46 people. So I want you to think about like hundreds of people in class on day 1 of year 1 of university, graduated with 45. And when I think about my professional writing degree, it was even lesser than that by way of the numbers, because it was a technical skill that involved critical thinking, and people who could not bridge the gap between knowing what to think based on what you told them to think and how to think based on thought exploration and cultivating a roadmap on their own. That was the difference between who graduated from university and who dropped out of it, or who was expelled from it, right? Because even it wasn't always the case that people dropped out. Sometimes people were expelled. And so I just wanted to have that conversation here because there's a difference. And so I think about growing up in the country and how that taught me to think critically. Because growing up in the country, I was taught how to live in the wild. I was taught how to identify poisonous plants from plants that were not poisonous. I was taught how to identify an animal that had rabies with an animal that did not, or an animal that was starving from an animal that was not, like an animal that was a threat from an animal that was not. I was taught how to really understand the elements. Like I knew how to find my way back to where I was if it was the case that I was lost. I was taught how to deal with complex and ambiguous situations from when I was young, just coping with the environment that I had lived in. But if you grew up thinking that the world is predictable and that your environment will always be stable and predictable, then when it becomes unpredictable, which is the climate that the digital era introduces, then those who are not equipped with the ability to think critically are going to spiral. And I'm not here to necessarily knock on the school education system, and I have done a lot of that, I have to say. But I'm more here to say, like, the educational system, it is what it is. Like, it's not going to go away. But how do we, as a community, as a family, like, supplement from there, right? To give our kids the skills to survive in a world that is not predictable, where there's a high degree of complexity, a high degree of ambiguity, of uncertainty and volatility. Like, how do you equip your kids to survive that? And you do that by teaching them how to think critically, like teaching them how to think when specific elements or factors are presented in front of them, teaching them how to circumvent manipulation, how to circumvent the algorithm that's really wanting to feed them propaganda or rage bait them or have them lean from one angle to another because it is of interest, because there's an interest of someone else who is manipulating those channels. Like, how do you keep your children and yourselves from being manipulated and from being pulled into the current that is the current of misinformation in this digital era? Like, the only way that you can do that you can survive that is through critical thinking. And I think about like just the ways that I myself was given the ability to think critically. Like, even I had mentioned in one of my videos that because violence against women was such a big issue growing up in the country, like there was a lot of issues around teaching men around consent, they taught us self-defense. And I think about the so many ways my education system rose to the challenge of equipping me for life, like equipping me for things not going in alignment to plan, that have really helped reinforce the way that I navigate in unpredictable settings. I don't expect my life to be predictable. I'm not going to fall apart part when it becomes unpredictable. Uncertainty isn't something that destabilizes me. Like I can navigate through instability, but that wasn't by accident. That was by training. That was by mastery. That was because the people in my community took it upon themselves to make sure that I had the skill set to think critically in life circumstances and also to provide informed opinions. I want to talk about in my second video how you create an informed opinion, but in this video I just want to talk about like the difference between following instructions and building your own roadmap. There's a massive difference, and school teaches you how to follow instructions and how if you follow a specific template in your life, you're going to get a specific outcome. And I have to tell you that life is less forgiving if you really do feel that that is going to get you the results that you're looking for. You need to be able to be responsive to the world around you and then to be adaptive to the world around you by dealing with volatility, by having your own vision. When you're dealing with uncertainty, by cultivating your own sense of understanding, knowing how to generate understanding, how to circumvent manipulation and circumvent different tactics and misinformation that is happening all around us. It's how to deal with complexity by creating clarity for yourselves, right? And so that's what critical thinking really drills down to, is taking ambiguity and with that being adaptable, being agile. And so I want to talk a little bit about how we supplement education by cultivating these skill sets. And so for me, I think about growing up, I think about the extracurricular activities that I did. I think about Pathfinders, which is a form of brownies and Boy Scouts that gave me survival skills, that taught me how to deal with the elements, that taught me not just camping for fun's sake, but like different skills that you would want to have with you when you're camping so that you can survive in the wild, or even going to school in the country and being taught about like how to identify poison ivy or how to identify like poisonous plants, or how you, if you're lost in the forest, like what do you do? Or if you're lost anywhere, like what do you do? And while I live in Europe, is less of a grid because growing up, I was always told like if you're lost, you take 4 lefts to go back to where you first started and you'll find yourself back to that position, and then you sort of reorient, but you never give the impression that you're lost because you don't want to put like attention to yourself. And so when I'm lost, like I know that I'm lost, but I really do make a point to make sure that no one else does. And that's critical thinking, right? And that was taught to me. That wasn't something that I just had this inherent know-how on how to do. And I think that that's what we need to focus on by way of bridging the gap. And that's also what Project Purpose is aiming to do, bridge the gap between what you're learning in school, which is what to think, and from there supplementing it with how to think. Like how do you take the things that you know and you leverage them in intelligent and innovative and creative ways to support you as you grow and learn in this lifetime. So that was something that I wanted to leave with you today, some food for thought for you. Now, if I have piqued your interest, then I do suggest that you take a look at our website. We do offer parent-child workshops and leadership programs for children across all ages. And so our focus is on cultivating that critical thinking lens and that intellectual curiosity. And so for us, leadership competency is based in 4 fundamentals, and that's cultivating a sense of self-concept, autonomy, self-advocacy, and compassion. And we have a module for each of those core concepts. We also do provide programs and trainings for adults that give you the opportunity to find that alignment, find that clarity, so you can live a life that gives you meaning and fulfillment. So something for everyone in your families, even for you. And what I wanted to do before we close off today is leave you with one specific question. What has been 1 or 2 things that your school never taught you, but that adulthood demanded of you? And what is that gap? Help us to bridge that gap. I would love for you to interact with this video to tell me what that gap was. And let's keep that conversation going. And again, like it's not a crisis. I'm not trying to be sort of a crisis mongerer. I'm just saying that we now know, like knowing is the first step. Acknowledging that there's a problem, that there's a gap is the first step. And then from there, we bridge the gap. And we can do that on our own. We can supplement what it is that we're not receiving from our educational systems on our own to give our kids the skills they need to survive. Thank you again so much. And I look forward to chatting with all of you very soon.